Does Enveritas have its own verification?
We do, but we didn't. So we have 30 standards. They would look very familiar if you went to our website and looked at them. They would not look any different than others you've seen, and very reasonable set of issues around pesticides and labor issues and minimum wage, etc. We didn't really try and re-engineer those standards. We felt like they were actually there'd been a lot of thought put into that. There'd been a lot of civil society conversation. A lot of them were built up from ILO treaties and UN treaties over decades.
Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Map It Forward, friends. I'm your host, Lee Safar, and this is the first of a 5-part episode with a first-time guest on the podcast, David Browning from Enveritas. David, welcome to the podcast. Pleasure,
Lee. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. I am quite the fangirl, I have to say, of what you have been doing. I only recently learnt about Enveritas from Andrew Tolley. Andrew seems to be sending me all the most amazing guests at the moment. So Andrew, big shout out to you. We're going to be talking in this series about intentional problem solving in coffee. And before we get started, I kind of want to give people an insight into who you are. And I want to encourage people that just because you're going to hear a lot of corporate names here, don't be scared by any of that. This is going to be a really interesting conversation around some real problem solving that happens. So David, you are a trusted advisor for over 20 years now in working with some of the largest roasters in the world and some of the smaller specialty coffee roasters in the world. You've partnered with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, advised the White House in preparation for Pittsburgh G20 Summit. You have improved the lives of hundreds of thousands of coffee growers worldwide. You have showcased at World Economic Forum in Davos and developed case studies at Harvard Business School. And your current roles are a board member at the SCA, board member at Nespresso Sustainability Advisory Board, the ICO Coffee Public-Private Task Force, and Nespresso Regenerative Coffee Steering Committee. Try and say that with marbles in your mouth. That's quite the Aussie thing. And so all of this to say that Enveritas has a very intentional place that it holds in what it wants to achieve. So in this episode, we're going to talk about Enveritas and what it is. So what is Enveritas, David?
Yes, Enveritas is a startup, but it's a non-profit startup. So our goal is, instead of scaling up this startup and then being able to reward shareholders some in the future, our goal is to scale up the startup, but then take all of that wealth and then transmit it back to smallholder coffee farmers. And specifically, our goal is to end poverty in the coffee sector by 2030, which is now only 7 years away. So we have a steep climb ahead of us, but we, as we'll probably see throughout this conversation, we actually do see that as an achievable goal, and so one that we've actually put numbers behind over the years. So not just plucking a number out of the sky, but rather we intentionally think we can move from where we are to there by 2030.
How many people work for Enveritas?
So there's a team of about 80 scattered across all of the known continents, plus another group of about 400 or 500 who actually do the verification on the ground. So in total, it's probably 500, 600 people at this point. But our goal is really to reinvent the way sustainability verification has been done in the past 20 years. So that was really what we set out to do, is to re-engineer sustainability verification.
And folks, when I asked David why I had never heard about him, out of those 500 people that are on his staff, there are exactly 0 people that work in marketing. So am I right, David? So this is not something that you usually do. Podcasts are not something that you usually do, correct?
Not at all. No, we're more comfortable out in the field talking with farmers. We do not spend a lot of time doing PR and marketing, but but recognize we'll need to do more of that going forward.
So when it comes to innovation of sustainability verification, tell me more about what that exactly means.
Yeah, so verification has been around for at least longer, but in its main current form, 20 or 30 years, and it's not really a complicated idea. Consumers want to know that the goods that they buy have been produced in the right way. They'd like to know that there hasn't been slave labor associated with it. There hasn't been forest deforestation. So they sort of see all these bad things over here in the press, and then they've got these brands over here that they love. They've got their favorite coffee shop to go in, and they'd like to know that it's been produced in the right way. And it's not just consumers, but regulators would like to know that companies own owners and shareholders and civil society. So over the last 20, 30 years, there's been this growing momentum that people are more aware of the supply chains, and I'd like to know more about that. And there were ways that you could get that reassurance, and that was through certifications that have been around for for decades now. They started with the very good intent of being able to provide that assurance to consumers and to companies.
And when we talk about verifications within Enveritas, do you guys have your own verification, kind of like fair trades of verification and organics of verification? Does Enveritas have its own verification?
We do, but we didn't. So we have 30 standards. They would look very familiar if you went to our website and looked at them. They would not look any different than others you've seen, and very reasonable set of issues around pesticides and labor issues and minimum wage, etc. We didn't really try and re-engineer those standards. We felt like they were actually there'd been a lot of thought put into that. There'd been a lot of civil society conversation. A lot of them were built up from ILO treaties and then UN treaties over decades.
Folks, our first on-demand workshop, How to Become a Coffee Consultant, is now available for you to learn at your own pace for just €50, and it comes with a certificate upon completion. Go to mapperforward.coffee/workshops or click the link in the show notes for more details. Support this podcast by supporting our sponsors.
So we felt like that was actually that framework was fairly reasonable, but from working on the ground, and I spent most of the last 20 years working with smallholder farmers on the ground. They would often ask us, should we get certified, and we would go and look at the math. But from being on the ground, we could see that things weren't working the way it was initially intended, and those three main issues from a roaster point of view. The first issue was it was quite expensive, and as much as roasters wanted to build that out across their entire coffee purchases, what was actually happening is a modest number of consumers would actually pay for it, but a large number of consumers would not pay for it, and so it had to be just at the normal going rate. So then that became a very large expense for any coffee company, but obviously as the companies you get bigger and bigger, that becomes you get into tens of millions of dollars. The second problem was scale. That there were certified coffees out there, but they're really a pretty small minority. Even today, there's less than 20% of the world's coffee is certified. So most of the coffee farmers were excluded from that. If you're a big estate, yes, you'd be part of it. If you're part of a cooperative, yes. But most coffee farmers are not a big estate or part of a cooperative. They were really excluded. And this was a world that we could see was increasingly going this way. So we realized there was a need to work out a new way of how could you actually help smallholder farmers all over the world get involved. And thirdly, there were real quality control issues. We could see on the ground that there was a host of issues that needed to be redone to improve the quality of the way this was done. So, for example, the sample sizes weren't large enough. So sample sizes that were taken to do audits were based on an old rule of thumb from the 1920s that didn't actually hold statistical water. So whatever results were coming back, if you took a sample that was too small, so if I was to take a sample of two and to ask you and I, who do we think will be the next president of the United States, we would have a result, but it wouldn't be statistically meaningful because the sample was too small. So we had to build the sample size up. A lot of the audits weren't happening during the harvest, but that's precisely the time when you can go and find out what's really happening and understand labor issues. So we needed to address that. We needed to address perverse incentives. We didn't want a world where we were paid based on a good result. and the traditional systems create a lot of perverse incentives because they're only getting paid if you came back with 100%. So we changed that model to you'll pay us to do the work, but we want to remain sort of indifferent from a commercial point of view about what result we bring you, and you'll just have to absorb what we bring. So that was what was happening on the roaster side. But it also wasn't really happening for smallholders. Smallholders also, they had to pay for the audit on their side.
Right.
And
it's prohibitive.
That's fine from the state, but an average smallholder might earn a couple $100 a year, and an audit might cost $4,000. So that clearly didn't work. And so we said we want to re-engineer this so that it's free for coffee farmers. We felt that was the right way to line this. But that would mean we'd have to really drive the cost down while simultaneously increasing the surveys and increasing them by a lot. So a typical certification entity will do 2,000-3,000 surveys a year globally in coffee. We'll do 60,000. So it wasn't we had to increase it by a little, we had to increase it by a lot.
Wow.
So we had a lot to do. We had to work how to re-engineer this process to give it more integrity, work out how we're going to get to the whole world, and do that fast, which we have. So we now cover 90% of all the world's coffee and about 7 million farmers. So those 60,000 surveys provide a statistically representative sampling of about 2/3 of the world's coffee farmers, and do that in about 6 years. But so that was the task we set ourselves 6 years ago.
I have to ask, why coffee? What got you into coffee?
I was actually invited to back between 1999 and 2003. As most of the listeners would be aware, there was a big drop in coffee prices. So a perfect storm of a few different factors that came together. And I was working for a McKinsey company at the time, and a lot of the coffee companies came to McKinsey and asked, could you help us think about this issue and what could we do? We understand that smallholder farmers are hurting. What can be done about this? And it's not as easy as it first looks. And so we dived into the issue, but by the end of that work, I was very keen to commit my life to helping smallholder farmers out of poverty. So I jumped, went into the nonprofit sector, went to work for TechnoServe, and focused on helping smallholders out of poverty. And
then your intentional problem-solving life started in coffee.
It did, yeah. As I mentioned, so given the parameters we gave ourselves, which were quite challenging, we wanted to dramatically ramp up what had been done before, but clear barriers and why that hadn't been done before. We wanted to dramatically lower the cost by 70-80% for roasters, so that we could unlock it being done globally. But we also then want to reduce it even further, and we want to make it free for smallholders. And so clearly there's going to have to be something really different that was done. And fortunately for us, around about 2016, there were some real changes that took place with machine learning or artificial intelligence. And it's obviously that's tremendously in the news these days with ChatGPT. Where it really broke into popular consciousness, but around about 2016 was something really interesting happened with machine learning, and AI has been around for nearly 100 years now. So I think AI was working out how to play a game of checkers, I think in about the 1940s. It could beat the average checker player, I think, by about the 1950s, about at which time machine learning could then play chess. By I think it was the 1990s, IBM built a computer that was able to
Watson, right?
Watson or Watson or Big Blue, one of the two, but it was able to beat one of the world's grand checker masters. In the early start of this century, we started getting vacuum cleaners that knew not to fall downstairs, and of course self-driving cars, which we're now a lot more familiar with. But so it's been a very long journey. But 2016 was around the time when neural networks came into play, and that was quite a fork in the road for AI. It went from this old AI, which was much more about what is the problem I want to solve and what are all the steps that I'm going to have to code to work out how that would be solved, to changing to much more of the way, I guess you could say, the way humans learn, which is much more fuzzy. A toddler doesn't doesn't look at an instruction manual to work out how to get the cookie jar. They sort of work it out in very fuzzy trial and error. And so neural networks were far more expansive in their capabilities. And that was important for what we were trying to do. Obviously, there's a lot in the news about the future of AI and machine learning, whether it's for good or bad, but certainly was a very good purpose that we could employ it to, and that was to dramatically reduce the costs of what we're doing, increase the quality, and then be able to go after the issues we're after. So we embedded machine learning, digitized the whole process, took it out of the pen and paper realm, which is something that's been happening in industries all over the world over the past 10 or 15 years. A lot of industries. I met a guy a few years ago, surprisingly, who told me that still most hotel bookings are done with pen and paper, which surprised me. But
wow.
wow. So there's still a lot of that to be done, and there's tremendous efficiencies, as you might imagine, to be gained by if you can just digitize everything. And we're getting increasingly used to digitization, including when we go to a local coffee shop where we're used to everything just being seamless and non-paper, and everything goes from the phone to the hardware back to the phone, etc.
Before we wrap up this episode, I want to ask you a little bit about that technology with relationship to the producers and getting them to fill in all the information with regards to the certification. How are they leaning into the technology, or do you have people that are on the ground that are taking care of that side of things for them to do the audits?
So the whole thing is done as a verbal conversation, and yes, we deal in, because everything has to be done in a local language. That's one of the things we had to solve for. So the historical world was that you trained up an auditor who was very good, really knew this world, and then you ship them out to various places to do the work.
Right.
We can go to countries where there's 20, 30, 40 languages in the country. So we'll use young people from the actual areas, train them up so that the whole thing can be done in their own language. When we started, there was a lot of skepticism. A lot of the people we initially talked to about this, I just cannot believe that farmers are going to want to talk to you. And he said, you're not going to try and pay them. You're just going to ask them to share their experience, what's going on in their lives. And we said, look, we've been working with smallholder coffee farmers for a lot of years. We believe that if we're courteous with their time and we don't make it an enormous ordeal, we did want to be able to show up unannounced. That was one of the things we wanted to fix. Rather than giving advance notice and audit, we thought it'd have a lot more credibility if you just sort of showed up unannounced. Mm-hmm. And we found that farmers were very receptive. I think there's probably, I haven't looked lately, but I think probably less than 3%, something like that, of farmers say, look, I'm sorry, I'm too busy.
Right.
And come back. But the vast majority of farmers are very happy to talk with us about the challenges that they face, and so we've found that not to be a barrier.
Yeah, awesome. The one thing that I have definitely come to realize through having this podcast is one problem we need to solve for is that farmers are continuously feeling that they're not being seen by the consuming end of the industry. And I think something like what you guys are doing is helping them to be seen and heard. So that doesn't surprise me that they were open to talking with you. It's really great. So go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, I think one thing I see time and time again in the coffee industry is it is such a vastly fragmented supply chain that mm-hmm. that some coffee farmers are very easy to get to. They're in easily accessible countries, or they're on roads near capital cities. But there's a whole host of coffee farmers who never see people. We just visited a coffee community in Papua New Guinea to work with them on clean water, and I think we were the first visitor to come to that school in 30 years. So
wow. PNG seems to be one of those places where you keep hearing about how difficult it is to get to the coffee farms. You've got to get there by plane first of all, and then drive for 12 hours and then take another seaplane and do all these kinds of really extraordinary things to get to the coffee farm to taste these extraordinary coffees, but they've never seen white people before. They've never been visited by anybody who's purchasing coffee before.
I mean, every country has its challenges. In Yemen, it's challenging to have your phone out in the open because of security risk.
Right.
In Brazil, the team just traveled 150,000 kilometers in the last 3 or 4 months.
Wow.
So every country has its challenges, but credit to the Enveritas team. They've just really worked out how to do extraordinary work across 25, 26 countries and all the continents.
It speaks very clearly to the mission that you guys have and the way that how committed the staff are. So that's really exciting. Over the next few episodes, folks, we're going to talk about some very specific problems that the Enveritas team have solved. So in the next one, we're going to talk about wet meals. So join us for that. It's a great story. So please join us for the next episode. Peace, love, and peanut butter. Have an amazing rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in, friends. There are 2 ways you can support this podcast. Firstly, become a paid member of our YouTube channel. Secondly, you can join our Patreon for as little as $3 a month. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video before you leave, and check the show notes for more information. Now, this is what you should check out next.